When I first met James, it felt like finding an unexpected treasure. He was everything I'd hoped for in a partner: kind, steady, with a gentleness that felt like a rare gift. He had a strength in him, a quiet sort of resilience, that made me feel safe in ways I hadn't felt before. Back then, he was the type of man who held doors open, who remembered my coffee order, who would listen to my worries without trying to solve them immediately. Just sitting there, nodding thoughtfully. But there was something else he brought with him, a part of his life he never hid yet always seemed cautious about bringing fully into our shared world: his son, Ryan. I knew about Ryan from the beginning, and in those early days, I assured myself that his existence didn't have to complicate anything. I thought I could love James deeply and find a place for Ryan in my heart, too, creating a seamless family with just a bit of patience. But I had underestimated what it meant to step into the role of a mother figure for a child who didn't want me. Ryan was a young teenager when James and I got married, old enough to remember his own mother clearly, to see me as an interloper. There were moments, in those early days, where he seemed like any other kid, polite in front of others. At times even curious about me. But those moments were few, fleeting. It didn't take long for his resentment to seep through in small but unmistakable ways. It was in the way he would avoid making eye contact when I spoke to him, or the way he'd slip past me, barely acknowledging my presence in the house. I was prepared to be patient, to give him time to accept me. I tried to get to know him, cautiously, delicately, afraid of pushing too hard and doing more harm than good. But every time I extended a hand, he seemed to pull further away. James, caught in the middle, would tell me to give it time. He'll come around, he'd say. He just needs to get used to things. And so, I waited, holding on to James' assurances like lifelines. For a while, I tried to brush off Ryan's behavior. I told myself it was just typical teenage defiance. Maybe I even believed it. But his defiance soon began to change shape, turning into something darker, more deliberate. He would go out of his way to ignore my requests, sometimes outright disobeying the house rules we had set together with James. Each time, it felt like he was daring me to do something, to react in a way that would let him point and say, "See, I knew she didn't belong here." And it hurt. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. I'd had friends who became step-parents, and I tried to take their advice, to let things roll off my back, to remember that Ryan's resistance wasn't personal. But how could it not feel personal when he was attacking the foundation of our life? It felt as if each act of rebellion wasn't just aimed at me, it was aimed at the fragile family I was trying to build. James, of course, would always try to smooth things over. He'd talk to Ryan, pull him aside, and have quiet, whispered conversations that would usually end with Ryan storming off to his room, leaving me and James in tense silence. Those moments put tiny cracks in my marriage, the kind of fractures I told myself would heal over time. But instead, those cracks only seemed to widen, splitting into deeper fissures that ran through the heart of my marriage. Over the next few years, Ryan's behavior grew worse. The small, petty rebellions of his younger years turned into something sharper, something that cut at me in ways I couldn't ignore. He became openly defiant, skipping curfews, lying about where he'd been, sometimes even bringing trouble into the house. More than once, I'd come home to find things misplaced, broken, or outright ruined, small pranks that might have seemed childish but felt like deliberate reminders that I was a guest in his home, an outsider. What bothered me most was that I was alone in dealing with it. James would listen to my complaints, nod, frown, and tell me he'd talk to him, but nothing ever changed. Ryan's behavior was pushing us further apart, but James seemed to think it was just a phase, something we could weather if we waited it out. I wasn't sure how much longer I could wait. Gradually, I began to feel invisible in my own home. The friends I tried confiding in were sympathetic, but they didn't truly understand. They'd say things like, "Teenagers are just like that," or, "He'll grow out of it," not realizing how much those words stung, as if my struggles were trivial, something to be brushed off. I felt trapped between my love for James and the resentment building toward Ryan. A resentment I hated admitting to myself. I had never wanted to feel this way toward a child, especially not my husband's child. I started pulling back, spending more time at work, lingering late at the office just to avoid the tension at home. I found myself looking for excuses to stay out, to avoid coming back to the house that felt less and less like mine. When I did come home, I'd retreat to my room, finding solace in the smallest, quietest spaces, anything that made me feel less suffocated. And then, one evening, it all came to a head. Ryan had crossed a line, doing something so hurtful and deliberate I couldn't ignore it anymore. He had taken something precious of mine, a family heirloom passed down from my mother, and destroyed it in a fit of anger. I felt shattered, not just because of the item itself but because it represented my connection to my family. to a life I had brought into this marriage in good faith. That night, I confronted James. I told him I couldn't do this anymore, that I needed him to choose, to stand by me or risk losing me forever. The words came out of my mouth in a rush, filled with all the frustration, the heartbreak, and the desperation I'd been holding in for years. I remember the look on James' face as I spoke. He looked devastated, torn in a way that broke my heart even as I spoke. But when he finally spoke, his answer was clear. He said he couldn't abandon Ryan, that he had a responsibility to his son, that no matter what, Ryan was family. It felt like a knife cutting through me. I had been his family too, or so I had thought. Yet, in that moment, his choice was clear. I left that night. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know where I was going. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I packed a few bags, barely able to see through the tears clouding my vision, and walked out into the night. The sound of the door clicking shut behind me felt heavier than it should have. A final, resounding echo that told me this wasn't just a temporary break. I knew I was leaving behind more than just a house. I was leaving behind everything I had built with James. Every memory, every dream, every hope that had kept me going for so long. I remember sitting in my car, my hands clutching the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to give in to the pain, but it clawed its way up, choking me until I couldn't hold it back any longer. I sat there, parked in some empty lot, sobbing until my chest hurt, until I felt emptied out, drained. I spent the night in a cheap motel, the kind of place where the sheets smelled faintly of bleach and the air conditioner rattled loudly in the corner. The room was cold and impersonal, the complete opposite of the warmth I had once known. But that night, it was a kind of refuge, a place where I could let the weight of everything settle over me without trying to hold it together for anyone else. In the morning, I woke to a strange sense of calm, the kind that follows after you've cried yourself dry. The pain was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it felt manageable, like something I could fold up neatly and tuck away until I had the strength to face it. Over the next few weeks, I started piecing together a new life. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, nothing fancy but comfortable, a place that felt quiet and safe. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and staying late at the office whenever I could. Work became a kind of sanctuary for me, a place where I could focus on something outside of myself. Something that didn't remind me of what I'd lost. Every morning, I'd wake up and go through the motions of my day, trying to convince myself that I was okay, that I could move on from this. But the truth was, I felt hollow. I would come home at night, sit in the quiet of my little apartment, and feel the emptiness closing in around me. I had lost not only my husband but the life I had built. The family I had tried so hard to create. I had given everything to that life, to that marriage, and now it felt like there was nothing left of me. I'd see couples walking down the street, hear laughter spilling out from restaurants as I walked home, and it would all feel like a cruel reminder of the life I'd once had. I tried to ignore it, to look away, but the pain was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to remind me of what I'd lost. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and wonder if I had done the right thing. Should I have stayed, tried harder to make things work? Maybe if I had been more patient, more understanding, James would have come around, and Ryan would have softened. But I knew, deep down, that those were just fantasies. I had given everything I had to that marriage, and in the end, it hadn't been enough. I found myself questioning my worth, wondering why my love hadn't been enough for James. He had chosen his son over me, and no matter how many times I tried to rationalize it, it still hurt. I tried to remind myself that his decision wasn't a reflection of my worth. But that was easier said than done. The wound was too fresh, too raw to ignore. It was during those sleepless nights that I felt the weight of my isolation most acutely. I hadn't just lost James, I had lost the life I had built with him. The dreams we had shared, the future I had envisioned. I had poured so much of myself into that life, and now I was left with nothing but the empty shell of what used to be. As the months passed, I began to hear whispers about James and Ryan. Friends, mutual acquaintances, and even neighbors from the old neighborhood would mention things in passing. Little tidbits of information that reached me through the grapevine. It wasn't intentional, I don't think. People just didn't know how to talk to me anymore. Didn't know how to act around me. Apparently, things were falling apart at the house. Ryan's behavior had become even more erratic, more volatile. James, once so strong and steady, was struggling to hold everything together. I heard stories of shouting matches that could be heard from the street, of police cars parked outside the house late at night, of neighbors who were beginning to feel uneasy. Hearing these things brought me no comfort, only a strange, hollow sadness. I didn't want this for James. Despite everything, I still cared about him, still remembered the man I had fallen in love with. I had once dreamed of a future with him. And now, hearing about his struggles felt like watching that dream crumble into dust. There were days when I would sit alone in my apartment, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me until I could hardly breathe. I had left James to deal with Ryan on his own, and now he was paying the price. Part of me felt responsible, like I had failed him somehow, like I should have done more to support him. But then I would remember the years of pain, the way Ryan had treated me, and I knew I couldn't have stayed. It wasn't healthy, not for me, and maybe not for James either. But the guilt lingered, mingling with the sadness that had become a part of my everyday life. I felt like I was caught between two worlds, the life I had lost and the life I was trying to build. Neither of which felt fully mine. I couldn't go back to James, but I didn't know how to move forward either. I was stuck in a limbo of my own making, haunted by memories of what could have been and the reality of what was. One night, just as I was settling into bed, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something in me knew it was James before I even picked up. His voice on the other end was weak, strained, carrying a weight of desperation I had never heard before. He told me he didn't know what to do, that Ryan was out of control, that he feared for his own safety. He sounded broken, a shell of the man I had once known. Listening to him, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, sympathy, sadness. Part of me wanted to help him, to be there for him as I had always been. But another part of me remembered the hurt, the betrayal, and I couldn't bring myself to let him back into my life. I told him I was sorry, that I couldn't help him, and hung up the phone, feeling a strange, hollow ache settle in my chest. That night, I lay in bed, my mind swirling with thoughts of James, of Ryan, of the life I had left behind. I knew that James was suffering, that he was paying the price for his choice, but as much as it pained me, I couldn't be the one to save him. A few weeks passed after James' call, but the sound of his voice lingered in my mind, a ghost I couldn't shake. I felt haunted by his pain, as if the weight of his despair had somehow attached itself to me. Even though I had walked away, I knew that my decision was the right one for me. I couldn't go back to a life of heartache and resentment, but that didn't make it any easier to let go. Then, one afternoon, I received a call from a mutual friend. Her voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, as she told me what had happened. Ryan had been arrested. The news landed like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. I felt a rush of emotions: shock, sadness, and, somewhere deep down, a flicker of relief. It was the kind of relief that comes from the confirmation of a long-feared truth. Like watching a storm finally break after days of tension in the air. I had always known, on some level, that Ryan's anger would lead him down a dark path, but to hear it confirmed left me with a bitter taste in my mouth. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know what he'd done, or the circumstances that had led to his arrest. All I knew was that he was in trouble, and that James' world had finally crumbled around him. I felt a strange, hollow ache, a sadness that was almost indistinguishable from relief. It was as if the final chapter of our story had been written, and there was no turning back. The news of Ryan's arrest reached me slowly, trickling through the same network of friends and acquaintances who had unwittingly kept me informed of James' life. I learned that James had taken it harder than anyone could have anticipated. He had always been a proud man, someone who took his role as a father seriously, who had prided himself on the family he thought he was building. But now, that family was in ruins, and the responsibility he had once cherished had become a burden he could no longer bear. A few days after the news broke, James called me again. This time, his voice was even weaker, more broken than before. He apologized, his words tumbling out in a way that felt desperate, almost frantic. He told me he was sorry for everything, for the choices he had made, for the pain he had caused. He begged me to forgive him, to understand that he had only done what he thought was right. As I listened, I felt a strange detachment, a distance that allowed me to hear his words without the sting of pain. It was as if I were listening to a stranger, someone I had once known but no longer recognized. I realized, in that moment, that the love I had once felt for him had transformed into something else, something colder, something that no longer held the power to hurt me. When he finished speaking, I took a deep breath and told him that I forgave him. Not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I needed to let go. I needed to release the hold he had over me, to free myself from the chains of our past. He sounded relieved, thanking me in a voice thick with emotion. But I knew that our conversation had been for my benefit, not his. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet calm that settled over me like a balm. I had finally let go of the life we had shared, and in doing so, I had freed myself from the pain that had haunted me for so long. In the days that followed, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since I'd left James, I felt free from the guilt, the resentment, the sadness that had weighed me down. I realized that I had spent so much of my life trying to be what others needed, trying to be the perfect wife, the understanding stepmother, the patient partner, but in doing so, I had lost sight of myself, of the person I was before James, before Ryan, before the heartache. I began to embrace my independence, savoring the quiet moments in my apartment, the freedom to make choices without the weight of anyone else's expectations. I started going on long walks, exploring the city in ways I hadn't before. I took up hobbies I had once loved but had abandoned over the years: painting, writing, even cooking elaborate meals for myself, meals I could enjoy in peace. With each passing day, I felt more like myself, like the person I had once been but had forgotten. I realized that I didn't need a partner to complete me, that I was whole on my own. I had learned to find strength in my solitude, to embrace the life I was building, a life that was mine alone. As the months passed, I found myself looking forward to each new day with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. I no longer felt haunted by memories of my past or weighed down by the choices I had made. Instead, I felt free, liberated from the expectations that had once held me captive. I began making plans for the future. Not grand plans or elaborate dreams, but small steps that felt meaningful and real. I thought about moving to a new city, starting fresh in a place where no one knew me or my story. The idea excited me, filling me with a sense of adventure, of possibility. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, watching the sun set over the city, I realized that I was finally ready to let go completely. I was ready to leave behind the ghosts of my past, to embrace the unknown, to live life on my terms. I didn't need validation from anyone else, didn't need approval or acceptance. I was enough, just as I was. The day I decided to leave the city felt like a milestone, a moment of quiet triumph. I packed up my belongings, leaving behind the remnants of my old life, the reminders of a love that had once meant everything but had ultimately taught me the importance of self-worth. I didn't feel sadness or regret, only a quiet contentment, a peace that came from knowing I was finally free. As I drove out of the city, the sun rising over the horizon, I felt a sense of exhilaration, a thrill that pulsed through me with every mile. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It excited me, filling me with a sense of wonder and possibility. I realized, in that moment, that my journey wasn't about finding another partner, or building a new family, or seeking validation from anyone else. It was about finding myself, about embracing the strength and resilience that had carried me through the darkest moments. I was finally ready to live for myself, to build a life that was mine alone. As I reached the outskirts of the city, the past fading behind me like a distant memory, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was no longer the woman who had once been trapped in a cycle of heartbreak and resentment. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned the hard way that self-worth isn't something anyone else can give you. I had loved, I had lost, and I had survived. And in that survival, I had found something precious: myself. The road stretched out before me, open and endless, filled with possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew, without a doubt, that I was finally ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly free. The open road stretched before me, and with each mile, I felt layers of my past peeling away. Driving alone, with no destination in mind, was something I hadn't done in years. For too long, my life had been about structure, about compromise and responsibility, about shaping myself to fit the expectations of others. But now, for the first time, I was living solely for myself. The days on the road were quiet, filled with stretches of silence that felt unfamiliar at first, but slowly grew comforting. I traveled through small towns and sprawling cities, winding roads and open highways, each stop a new experience, a reminder that there was a vast world out there beyond the confines of my old life. I found myself savoring the solitude, learning to embrace the quiet moments, finding peace in the simplicity of my own company. At night, I'd sit by the window of whatever small inn or hotel I'd found, watching the stars above, letting my mind wander. The quiet brought with it a sense of clarity, a space to reflect on the woman I had become, and the journey that had brought me here. I thought about James, about Ryan, about the pain and heartbreak that had shaped so much of my life. But rather than feeling bitterness, I felt gratitude, a strange, unexpected gratitude for the lessons those years had taught me. In those quiet moments of reflection, I came to realize something profound about myself. I had spent so many years tying my worth to the roles I played: wife, stepmother, partner, that I had lost sight of my own intrinsic value. I had believed that my worth was something I needed to earn. Something I needed to prove through sacrifice and compromise. But now, in the silence of those nights, I understood that my worth wasn't something anyone else could give or take away. It was something that had always been there, buried beneath layers of doubt and fear, waiting for me to uncover it. This realization was both freeing and humbling. I no longer felt the need to seek validation or approval from anyone else. I no longer felt the weight of expectations pressing down on me. No longer felt compelled to shape myself to fit someone else's vision of who I should be. I was enough, just as I was imperfect, flawed, but whole. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sudden urge to write. I hadn't written anything in years, not like this, just for myself, with no one else in mind. I found a pen and a scrap of paper, and without thinking too much, I began to write a letter to my former self. I wrote to the woman I had been, the woman who had fallen in love with James, who had tried so hard to build a family, who had given everything only to be left with nothing. I wrote to her with compassion, with understanding, with a sense of forgiveness that I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. I told her that she had been brave, that she had done her best, that her sacrifices had not been in vain. I told her that she was worthy of love and happiness, not because of what she had given to others, but simply because she was herself. I told her that she was strong, resilient, capable of surviving even the deepest heartbreak, and that she had emerged from it stronger than ever. Writing those words felt like a release, a final act of letting go. I folded the letter and tucked it away, a reminder of the journey I had taken, the pain I had endured, and the strength I had found within myself. Eventually, I settled in a small, sunlit town nestled by the coast, a place where the air smelled of salt and the sound of waves became my new backdrop. It was a town that didn't hold any memories of James or Ryan. A place untouched by the shadows of my past. Here, I felt free to start anew, to build a life that was wholly and completely mine. I found a modest home with a little garden, a place where I could wake up each morning and feel a sense of peace. A sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in years. I filled the house with books, with plants, with little pieces of myself alive, crafted from the things that brought me joy, rather than the things that had been expected of me. I began to make new dreams. Small ones at first, like learning to garden, taking long walks along the beach, trying my hand at painting. I discovered a love for early mornings, for the quiet solitude of dawn, for the way the world felt new and full of possibility. Slowly, I found myself opening up to the world again, connecting with people on my own terms, building relationships that were rooted in authenticity and mutual respect. One afternoon, as I sat in my garden, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the heartbreak, the years of struggle, they all felt distant now, like something that had happened to someone else, a part of my story but no longer the defining chapter. I realized that I no longer felt bitterness or regret. I felt a quiet sense of acceptance, a peace that came from knowing I had survived, that I had emerged from the storm stronger and more resilient than ever. The choices I had made, the sacrifices I had endured, had all led me to this moment, to this life that I could finally call my own. For the first time, I felt grateful not just for the good moments, but for the painful ones as well. They had shaped me, molded me, helped me find a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I had loved, I had lost, and I had found myself. And in the end, that was enough. As the sun set that evening, casting a warm glow over my garden, I felt a deep sense of contentment. I was no longer haunted by the ghosts of my past, no longer bound by the expectations of others. I was free to live my life on my own terms, to embrace each new day with a sense of curiosity and wonder. I knew that life would continue to bring its share of challenges, that there would be days when I felt lonely or uncertain, but I also knew that I was strong enough to face whatever lay ahead. I had found a peace within myself, a resilience that would carry me through whatever came next. And as I looked out at the world around me, I felt a sense of excitement, a thrill at the endless possibilities that lay before me. I was ready to move forward, to embrace the life I had fought so hard to create, a life that was fully, beautifully, and authentically mine. In that moment, I knew that I had finally come home to myself. As the years passed, I continued to build a life that was rooted in freedom, in self-worth, in the quiet joy of independence. I traveled to places I had always dreamed of, met people who enriched my life in ways I hadn't anticipated, and cultivated friendships that were based on mutual respect and genuine connection. The pain of my past became a distant memory, a part of my story but no longer the defining chapter. I had moved beyond it, grown past it, and in doing so, I had found a strength and resilience that would carry me forward into whatever lay ahead. And as I walked along the beach one morning, watching the sun rise over the horizon, I felt a deep sense of peace. A quiet joy that filled me with gratitude. I had lived, I had loved, and I had learned, and in the end, I had found myself.